If you walked past a man sleeping on a piece of cardboard outside a tube station tonight, you would probably think that was sad but unusual. What if I told you that 13,231 people slept rough in London last year, the highest number ever recorded in this city's entire history? What if I told you that 7 of London's own councils are so broke they needed emergency cash from the Treasury just to keep the lights on? What if I told you that the average Londoner now needs nearly 12 years of their entire gross salary just to buy the median home in their own city? This is not a city recovering from a rough patch. This is a city quietly unraveling, and the truly alarming part is how few people have noticed how far it has already gone. So let us talk about it properly. Because what is happening in London right now is the result of decades of decisions, decades of neglected warnings, and a system that was always quietly built to benefit people at the top, while everyone else kept being told the city was doing fine. And to be clear, London is still formidable. It is the second most powerful financial centre on the planet, just 2 points behind New York on the Global Financial Centres Index. It still generates 22.3% of the UK's entire economic output. The glass towers are still there, the restaurants in the city are still full at lunchtime on a Tuesday. But underneath all of that surface, the data tells a completely different story. And once you sit with these numbers, they are genuinely difficult to shake off. Start with housing. Because housing is where this story begins and where it gets the most painful. The average house price in London right now sits at £542,000. And here is what most people do not mention when they report that figure. London is the only region in the entire country where house prices are currently falling, down 1.7% year-on-year as of early 2026, according to the Office for National Statistics, and that decline has now continued for 6 consecutive months. You might think that sounds like relief, prices finally coming down after years of runaway growth, but it is not relief. It is a signal that the city is becoming too expensive even for the relatively wealthy buyers who are propping up the top end of the market. When demand retreats at that level, it does not make life easier for people at the bottom. It just means the whole structure starts to look unstable from multiple directions at once. Meanwhile, if you are renting, which hundreds of thousands of Londoners are because they simply have no other option, the average monthly rent in London is now £2,290. Think about that. In the northeast of England, the average rent is £759 a month. Same country, same language, same government, same national minimum wage. Nearly 3 times the price based purely on postcode. And rent inflation in London peaked at 11.5% in November 2024, meaning landlords were putting rents up by over 11 pence in every pound in a single year, while wages were not keeping pace by any reasonable measure. For anyone renting in London during that window, the maths was not difficult, it was impossible. The affordability ratio tells the full story in one number. The median London home costs 11.7 times the median London salary, almost 12 years of gross earnings. Not 12 years of savings, 12 years of your entire pre-tax income spent on literally nothing else whatsoever. Not food, not transport, not clothing, not a holiday, just the house. A full generation has been structurally priced out of ownership in the city where they were born, raised, educated, and built their careers. And when that option closes off permanently, the social consequences cascade through everything else. People delay having children. They move away from aging parents who need support. They leave the city entirely, taking skills, energy, and tax revenue with them. The cost of unaffordable housing is not just financial. It reshapes lives and communities in ways that take decades to become fully visible. What that looks like in practice is a slow population bleed. Young professionals and families have been moving out of London toward Manchester, Bristol, Leeds, Birmingham, and further north for years now. They are not leaving because they want to. They are leaving because the city has made the basic maths of raising a family here unworkable. And when the people who would normally be the next wave of taxpayers, consumers, and community anchors leave, the city they leave behind has to find other ways to replace what they contributed. It has not worked that out yet. So when people cannot afford to buy and cannot afford to rent, where exactly do they end up? More than 183,000 Londoners are currently homeless and living in temporary accommodation. That is the official figure from London councils, published in January 2025. 1 in 50 residents of the capital. These are not people who fell through some distant crack in the system. These are families, working adults, people who had jobs and flats and daily routines, who got hit by a rent increase or a no-fault eviction and ended up placed in a council bed and breakfast or a hostel, sometimes miles from their children's school, their workplace, their entire social network. Children switching schools mid-year because the emergency housing is in a different borough. Parents spending 3 hours a day on public transport just to hold on to a job that barely covers the temporary accommodation costs the council is billing them for. That is not a statistic. That is someone's actual life, right now, in one of the most famous cities in the world. The social housing waiting list has hit a 10-year high. 336,366 households are currently waiting for a social home across London boroughs. London has 13% of England's population but carries 25% of England's entire social housing waiting list. In Lambeth alone, the list grew from just over 15,000 households in 2014 to more than 38,000 by 2024, a 150% increase in a single decade. In some boroughs, at current allocation rates, the projected wait for social housing stretches past 100 years. Not a decade, not a generation, a century. At some point this stops being a housing system with a backlog and becomes something else entirely. A housing system that has quietly given up on actually housing people, and the financial cost of all this is staggering in ways that most people do not fully realise. London councils are now spending £5.5 million every single day on homelessness services. That is up from £4.2 million a day the year before. Over £1 billion of that total went on nightly paid emergency accommodation, an 80% jump in a single year. This is not planned, managed expenditure building toward a solution. This is a system in permanent triage, paying emergency prices for emergency measures, with no structural fix anywhere on the horizon. Now here is where it gets particularly grim. Because the councils responsible for housing these people are themselves going broke. 7 London boroughs received what is called exceptional financial support from the government in 2025-26. That is the formal term for emergency Treasury borrowing consent to prevent councils from being unable to meet their legal obligations. The total across those 7 boroughs was £418 million. In the year before, only 2 London boroughs needed that support, worth £71 million between them. In 12 months, the number of boroughs in financial emergency more than tripled, and the cost to the public purse increased 6-fold. Barnet, Croydon, Enfield, Haringey, Havering, Lambeth, Newham, 7 boroughs representing millions of ordinary Londoners who did nothing wrong and are now watching their local services quietly disappear. Croydon is the starkest example of what this looks like in practice. It has received emergency support every single year since 2020. It has issued 3 formal financial emergency notices, and right now, Croydon Council spends £71 million a year purely on servicing its debt, just the interest, before a single bin gets collected, a single social worker turns up to a family in crisis, or a single library stays open for an extra hour. When more than a third of your annual budget goes purely on debt interest, everything else is whatever happens to be left over. And what is left over is never enough. This matters to you even if you do not live in any of those boroughs. Because when councils run out of money, they cut. They cut libraries, youth clubs, adult social care, domestic abuse services, housing support, the mental health drop-in, the after-school program. Every single thing that is not legally mandated. And the people who depend on those services most are always the people with the least ability to replace them privately. The wealthy barely noticed. Everyone else pays for it, in ways that are slow, grinding, and largely invisible to the national conversation. Step back for a moment and look at child poverty, because these numbers are genuinely difficult to reconcile with the image of London as a global success story. Around 700,000 children in London are living in poverty after housing costs are factored in. 1 in 3. In Tower Hamlets, the figure approaches 1 in 2. In every single London borough, child poverty exceeds 1 in 5, with the sole exception of Richmond. This is not a niche problem concentrated in a handful of struggling areas. This is the baseline condition for a significant proportion of the next generation growing up in one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Wealthy enough to rank second in global finance. Not wealthy enough, apparently, to feed its children adequately. The food bank data reflects that with brutal clarity. In London in 2023-24, Trussell Food Banks distributed more than 454,000 emergency food parcels, of which 162,000 went to children, a record for the capital and a 171% increase on 5 years earlier. 9 in 10 first-time users said the reason they came was simply that they ran out of money before the end of the month. Not because they had never worked, because rent, energy, food and transport have been pushed into a combination that no longer adds up for a growing number of people doing everything they were supposed to do. That paradox, a globally dominant city and a deeply food-insecure population living inside it simultaneously, is one of the defining contradictions of London right now. Now for the economy, where most people assume London remains untouchable, and in certain ways it genuinely does. The city still ranks second on the Global Financial Centres Index, just 2 points behind New York. The City of London's foreign exchange activity, its legal sector, its insurance market, these are competitive advantages built over centuries that rivals have been trying to chip away at for decades, with relatively limited success. London is not about to be replaced overnight, but something is happening at the company level that you cannot explain away. In 2024, 88 companies either delisted or transferred their primary listing away from the London Stock Exchange main market, the largest outflow since the 2008 global financial crisis, according to EY Parthenon. Flutter Entertainment moved to New York. Ashtead Group followed. Just Eat Takeaway delisted entirely. Fintech giant Wise announced in June 2025 it was shifting its primary listing to New York, and Arm Holdings, the British chip designer and the most anticipated tech IPO of the decade, chose New York over London in 2023 without a second thought. Only 18 IPOs raised capital in London across the whole of 2024, the lowest figure since records began. There was a partial recovery in 2025, but still well below historical norms. The consistent signal being sent, deal by deal and announcement by announcement, is that London is no longer the instinctive first choice for growth companies looking to raise serious capital. And that shift, if it compounds over a decade, has consequences that go well beyond the financial pages. And while that plays out in the city, crime has been making itself felt on every high street and every estate. Knife crime in London increased by 58.5% in just 3 years between 2021 and 2024. The Metropolitan Police recorded 16,789 knife and sharp instrument offences in 2024 alone. London's rate stands at 188 per 100,000 people, more than double the national average of 90. Policy Exchange found that only 1 in 20 robberies in the capital resulted in a charge last year, and more than 81,000 mobile phones were stolen through robberies and thefts in 2024. That is 222 stolen every single day. The Met's own monthly data does show that knife crime figures in 2025 have been tracking below the same months in 2024, and that genuine improvement should be acknowledged, but the baseline it is falling from remains the worst in modern London history. And if you want to see what prolonged economic pressure looks like at street level, look at the High Street. Across Greater London in 2024, 1,947 chain stores closed, while 1,383 opened, a net loss of 564 outlets in a single year, according to PwC and the local data company. Chemists, fashion retailers, banks, home furnishing stores, all pulling back. The categories that are actually growing are convenience stores and coffee shops, which tells you something precise about a city where people are still grabbing a flat white on their commute, but the high street they grew up browsing has steadily hollowed out behind them. Empty units do not just look bad. They reduce footfall for every business that stays, accelerate the closure of neighbours, and remove the social function of a high street that no online retailer has figured out how to replicate. Now you might be wondering why none of this has triggered a bigger political response. Part of the answer is geography. The people experiencing the sharpest edges of this crisis are often concentrated in boroughs that do not generate the kind of media coverage or political pressure that moves national agendas. Part of the answer is timing. Crises that unfold slowly and unevenly are much easier to ignore than acute ones. And part of it is that the people with the loudest voices in public debate are largely the people who own property in London, who still have functioning services, and for whom the city still works reasonably well. When you are doing fine, it is easy to assume the city is doing fine too. Transport is one area where London has genuinely stabilised rather than deteriorated further. Transport for London secured a 4-year capital funding deal in June 2025 worth £485 million for the coming year, nearly double the previous settlement, and Moody's upgraded its credit rating in response. That is real and meaningful progress. But TfL has had no day-to-day revenue grant from central government since 2018, relies entirely on fares for its operating budget, and raised those fares by 4.6% in March 2025. The network moves 8 million journeys a day, and it is holding together, but it is not growing, and for a city that keeps building new homes on its outer edges, a transport system that cannot expand eventually stops serving the people it was built for. So where does all of this leave us? London is not collapsing the way a building collapses. One dramatic moment, a clear before and after, something everyone can point to on a calendar. It is doing something more corrosive and more difficult to arrest. It is becoming a city that works extraordinarily well for a narrow and wealthy minority, increasingly poorly for the working professional middle, and barely at all for the roughly 1 in 3 children being raised in poverty within sight of the skyline. The gap between London's global prestige and the daily reality of the people living in it has never been wider. And the gap keeps growing a little more every single year. The 336,366 households on waiting lists are real people who applied for a home, were told to wait, and are still waiting with no clear end in sight. The 13,231 rough sleepers are real people at the sharp edge of a housing system that has entirely lost its ability to catch people when they fall. The 7 councils on emergency Treasury support are not individual management failures. They are the visible surface of a systemic funding crisis that is still deepening year on year. And the 700,000 children growing up in poverty are not an unfortunate side effect of a city that works. They are evidence that the city is not working, not for everyone, and perhaps not even for most people. What this city needs is not another strategy document or a cross-party working group. It needs a fundamental rethinking of who it is actually built for, how it funds the services that make it livable, and whether the version of London being constructed right now is one that the people already living here will recognise as home in 20 years' time. The evidence is no longer ambiguous, the data is no longer marginal, and the question of whether anyone with the power to change course has the political courage to actually try, that is, right now, an entirely open question. But London does not have the luxury of more time. The numbers are already compounding.